It started with a single microscopic crumb on a beige Persian rug, and it ended with my stepmother being escorted out of her own dinner party in handcuffs. Let's just say that when you prioritize a speck of dust over a human being's ability to breathe, the universe tends to correct the balance in a very violent, very public way. I'm looking at the photo of her arrest right now. The way the flashing blue lights from the squad car reflect off her perfectly polished windows is almost poetic. She spent 20 years trying to scrub every stain out of her life, and in the end, she became the biggest stain on the neighborhood's reputation. If you want to know how a high-end vacuum cleaner became the smoking gun in an attempted manslaughter case, and how I turned a dinner party into a crime scene, stay with me until the end. My name is Maya. I'm 24 years old, and for the last 3 months, I haven't been a person. I've been a contaminant. After a severe bout of double pneumonia that nearly turned into full-blown respiratory failure, I lost my apartment, my job, and about 30 pounds. I had to move back in with my father and his wife, Linda. And you have to understand something about Linda. She isn't just tidy. She is a clinical, aggressive perfectionist who treats her home like a surgical theater and treats dirt like a personal insult. To her, my illness wasn't a tragedy. It was a mess. It was clutter. It was a disruption to her aesthetic. The house always smelled like aggressive lavender and bleach, the kind of sharp chemical clean that burns the back of your throat. Even before I got sick, walking into that house felt like entering a museum where you weren't allowed to touch anything. But moving back in with a bulky, humming medical device, it was like I had parked a rusted tractor in the middle of her living room. Honestly, the tension was suffocating from day one. I was confined to the guest room on the first floor because I couldn't handle the stairs yet, and my life depended on an oxygen concentrator, a machine about the size of a carry-on suitcase that plugs into the wall and pushes purified air through a long, clear tube into my nose. It's not quiet. It makes this rhythmic chug-whoosh sound, 24 hours a day. To me, that sound was the rhythm of survival. To Linda, it was noise pollution. She didn't just hate the machine, she hated what it represented. Every time she walked past my room, she would sigh, this long, a heavy exhale that was louder than any words could be. She would glare at the plastic tubing snaking across the floor like it was a venomous snake waiting to strike her. I mean, she would literally kick the tube aside with her foot, looking at it with this mixture of disgust and annoyance, as if my need to inhale oxygen was a direct attack on her interior design choices. And here's the thing about living with a narcissist who values appearances over people. They make you feel like your survival is an imposition. I remember one afternoon, maybe 2 weeks in, when the delivery guy brought a refill of portable tanks. Linda didn't open the door for him. She stood behind the curtain, peeking out, terrified the neighbors would see the medical truck in the driveway. When she finally let him in, she was whispering, hissing at him to wipe his feet, demanding he not let the wheels of the dolly touch the hardwood. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't look at the tanks that were keeping me alive. She just looked at the tire marks on the porch and looked at me with this cold, dead stare, telling me that I needed to pay for a professional cleaner to fix the damage my delivery had caused. Have you ever realized that the person supposed to protect you is actually the one holding the door open for the wolf? My father was no help. He was the classic enabler, a man who had long ago decided that a quiet life was worth any moral cost. He saw what was happening. He saw me struggling to walk to the bathroom, gasping for air, while Linda complained that my slippers were scuffing the tiles. But whenever I tried to bring it up, whenever I tried to tell him that she was treating me like a stray dog she wanted to put down, he would just give me that tired, pleading look. He would say things like, "You know how she is about the house, Maya? She just wants things perfect. Don't take it personally." Don't take it personally? I was recovering from lung failure and she was spraying aerosol air fresheners directly outside my door because she said the sickness smell was leaking into the hallway. I mean, my lungs were barely functioning, and she was pumping chemical mist into my air supply because she cared more about the olfactory experience of her guests than whether her stepdaughter could actually breathe. It wasn't just the act of malice, it was the neglect disguised as fastidiousness. She would accidentally close the vents in my room to save on heating, claiming the furnace was drying out her antique wood furniture. I would wake up shivering, my chest tightening in the cold air. And when I confronted her, she would just give me this blank, innocent blink. She'd say that I should just put on another sweater, that I was being dramatic, that I was always looking for problems. The psychological toll was worse than the physical one. I started apologizing for existing. I would hold my breath when I walked through the living room so I wouldn't cough. I would hide the oxygen tubing under the rug when her friends came over because she told me it looked tragic. I was disappearing. I was becoming part of the furniture, an unwanted, ugly lamp that she couldn't wait to throw out. But the worst part was the machine. The oxygen concentrator. When it was the only thing keeping my blood saturation levels above the danger zone. If I disconnected for more than a few minutes, my vision would start to tunnel, my lips would turn blue, and my heart would start hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Linda knew this. The doctor had explained it to both of them in the hospital. He had looked Linda in the eye and told her, explicitly, that this machine was my lifeline. She heard him. I know she heard him. But to her, the machine was just an appliance that used electricity, an appliance that hummed, an appliance that had a thick, black power cord that ran across her pristine white living room carpet to the only outlet that was grounded properly. That cord. That damn cord. It was the bane of her existence. She would stare at it while we ate dinner. She would complain that it was a tripping hazard even though it was taped down. She would ask my dad if we could run it through the ceiling or under the floorboards, and when he said no, she would just purse her lips and glare at me, as if I had personally decided to run a suspension bridge through her sanctuary. I think deep down, I knew something was going to happen. You don't live with that kind of simmering resentment without feeling the heat. I stopped sleeping deeply. I would wake up at the slightest sound, my heart racing, checking to make sure the green light on my machine was still steady. I felt like an intruder in a hostile territory, sleeping with one eye open, waiting for the eviction notice. But I never thought the eviction notice would come in the form of a vacuum cleaner. I never thought she would actually cross the line from callous stepmother to active threat. I underestimated her vanity. I underestimated just how much she loved that rug, and just how little she cared if I was around to see it clean. The build-up to the dinner party was the final turning point. Linda was hosting the neighborhood HOA board, the inner circle, as she called them. These were the people she lived to impress. The house had to be flawless. For 3 days, she was a whirlwind of anxiety and bleach. She hired window washers. She had the curtains steam cleaned. And me? I was told to stay in my room. Out of sight, out of mind, she said, not even looking up from her list of hors d'oeuvres. Basically, I was the dirty secret she was trying to hide. And on the afternoon of the party, about 2 hours before the guests were set to arrive, the tension in the house snapped. The air felt thin, sharp, electric. I was lying in bed, the machine chugging away, reading a book, trying to make myself as small as possible. I heard the aggressive whir of her high-end vacuum starting up in the hallway. Closer. Louder. She was frantic, muttering to herself about dust, about shadows, about imperfections that only she could see. And then, the door to my room flew open. She didn't knock. She didn't say hello. She just stood there, holding the vacuum handle like a weapon, staring at the outlet where my life support was plugged in. It happened at 4:02 p.m. I know the exact time because I stared at the digital clock on my nightstand while my lungs were screaming for air, watching the numbers tick by like a countdown to an execution. You have to understand, the layout of the guest room was awkward. There was only one 3-prong grounded outlet near the bed, and that was where the concentrator lived. The rest were those old 2-prong outlets that couldn't handle heavy appliances. Linda stood there, vibrating with this manic energy, the heavy Dyson vacuum in one hand and the cord in the other. She didn't look at me. She looked at the rug. She was muttering about a shadow in the weave, a phantom stain that only she could see, and how the extension cord was all the way in the garage and she didn't have time to go get it because the caterers were coming at 5. And so, without asking, without even a warning glance, she reached down. The silence hit me before the suffocation did. The rhythmic chug-whoosh of the compressor, the sound that had been my lullaby for 3 months, just cut out. The green operating light died. The red power failure light blinked on, but the backup alarm, usually a piercing beep, was instantly drowned out by the roar of the vacuum cleaner. Let's just say, she didn't just unplug a lamp. She unplugged my lungs. She jammed the vacuum plug into the socket and hit the power switch. The machine roared to life, a high-pitched, expensive whine that filled the room. I tried to shout. I sat up in bed, my mouth opening, but the sound was swallowed by the motor. And then the air hunger started. It wasn't like holding your breath. It was like the air in the room suddenly turned into concrete. The residual oxygen in the tube lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then I was sucking on a plastic straw attached to nothing. My chest seized. It felt like a belt was being tightened around my ribs. I remember clawing at the sheets, trying to wave at her. But Linda? Linda was in the zone. She was vacuuming with this terrifying, rhythmic precision. She was pushing the heavy machine back and forth, humming to herself, completely oblivious to the person dying 3 feet behind her. I watched the back of her head. I watched her perfectly highlighted hair bounce with every stroke of the vacuum. I was gasping, making these horrible, wet, wheezing sounds, my vision starting to go gray at the edges, tunneling down until all I could see was her. She wasn't rushing. She was taking her time. She did the corners. She moved the armchair to get underneath it. Have you ever wondered how much your life is actually worth to the people around you? In that moment, I got the receipt. My life was worth less than a clean rug. The panic was primal. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, a frantic, irregular thudding that felt like it was going to crack my sternum. I tried to stand up to reach the plug, to rip her vacuum out of the wall, but my legs were jelly. I slumped back against the headboard, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't even grip the tubing to pull it off my face. I was drowning on dry land, watching my stepmother casually clean the floor of my tomb. It felt like an hour. The logs would later show it was exactly 5 minutes and 40 seconds. 5 minutes of absolute, suffocating terror. Finally, the roar stopped. The sudden silence was almost louder than the noise. I heard the click of the vacuum plug being pulled out. Then, casually, as if she were plugging in a toaster, she reconnected my machine. The compressor shuddered, groaned, and the whoosh returned. I gasped. I inhaled so hard it hurt, a desperate, tearing gulp of air that made me cough violently. The oxygen hit my blood like a drug, but the room was still spinning. I was clutching my chest, tears streaming down my face from the sheer physical stress of it, shaking like a leaf. And here is where the accident theory died. Linda didn't run to me. She didn't look horrified. She looked annoyed. She stood there, winding the cord around the vacuum hooks, and looked at me with this flat, irritated expression. She basically rolled her eyes and told me to stop being so dramatic. She said that I was young, that I could hold my breath for a few minutes, and that the carpet had been filthy. She didn't ask if I was okay. She commented that my face was red, and it would look bad for the photos later. That was the moment. That was the shift. I lay there, the oxygen rushing back into my nose, and I realized I wasn't looking at a clueless stepmother. I was looking at a predator. A predator who had justified my potential death as a household convenience. My father came home 20 minutes later, just as I was stabilizing. I was still shaking, sitting on the edge of the bed. When I told him, wheezing, my voice barely a whisper, what she had done, I expected him to be furious. I expected him to storm out and confront her. But Linda got to him first. She met him in the hallway, putting a hand on his chest, speaking in that soft, reasonable voice she used on the phone. She told him that I was having a panic attack because of the stress of the party. She told him the cord had popped out for a second, and I had spiraled into a tantrum. And so, my father came into my room, not to defend me, but to manage me. He looked tired. He looked at me with that pathetic, pleading softness and asked me to please, for his sake, not make a scene tonight. He said Linda didn't mean it. He said the house was old and the outlets were tricky. He basically asked me to swallow the fact that his wife had nearly killed me because he didn't want to ruin the dinner party. She's just stressed, Maya, he said. Let it go. Let it go. I looked at him. For a split second, and I remembered the dad who used to carry me on his shoulders at the zoo. I remembered the dad who sat up with me when I had the flu in 3rd grade. I missed that dad. But looking at this man, this hollow shell who was more afraid of his wife's mood than his daughter's death, I realized that Dad didn't exist anymore. He was just another obstacle. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was quiet. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. The fear evaporated. The sadness evaporated. All that was left was a cold, hard clarity. I stopped crying. I wiped my face. I looked at him and nodded. I told him he was right. I told him I was just tired and that I would stay in my room during the party so I wouldn't disturb anyone. He looked so relieved. He actually patted my hand, thanked me for being mature, and went off to shower. But as he closed the door, I wasn't thinking about being mature. I was thinking about the user manual for the oxygen concentrator I had read on the first day. I remembered reading about the data logging feature that tracked power interruptions for insurance compliance, and I remembered the text message I had sent Linda from the hospital last week about my oxygen levels, the one where she replied that I was whining. I looked at the machine. The red power failure light was still blinking slowly, waiting to be reset. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a witness. I picked up my phone. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I wasn't the victim in the guest room. I was the prosecutor building a case, and the trial was going to start during the appetizers. You have to understand, the scariest part of a betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the quiet realization that follows. It's that moment when your brain stops trying to protect you from the truth and finally lets you see the monster standing in the living room. For the next hour, the house was a symphony of performative chaos. I could hear Linda's heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floors, the sharp clack, clack, clack echoing like gunfire as she directed the caterers. I could smell the rich, savory scent of rosemary and garlic roasting in the oven, a smell that usually made me hungry, but now just made my stomach turn over. It was the smell of a celebration I wasn't invited to, cooked in a kitchen I was no longer welcome in. I was sitting in the dark. The only light came from the small-ish glowing LCD screen of my oxygen concentrator and the harsh blue light of my smartphone. I needed proof. My father's voice was still ringing in my ears. She didn't mean it. It was just a second. He was rewriting history before the ink was even dry. If I didn't get concrete evidence right now, this entire event would be gaslit into oblivion. By tomorrow morning, I would be the crazy daughter who ruined the party, and Linda would be the saint who tolerates her. So, I became a ghost in my own room. I locked the door, quietly, turning the latch so slowly it didn't make a sound. I crawled to the back of the machine, my hands shaking just enough to make it hard to read the serial number sticker. I needed the device ID to pair it with the manufacturer's app. I remembered seeing the brochure when we first rented it. And it was a smart flow model, designed to send compliance data to insurance companies to prove patients were actually using it. My fingers felt like ice as I typed the serial number into the app. Loading, connecting. The little spinning wheel on the screen felt like it was mocking me. I could hear Linda right outside my door, scolding a waiter about the placement of the napkins. If she walked in now, if she saw me huddled on the floor with my phone paired to the machine, she would know. She would pull the plug again, and this time she might not plug it back in. Connection established. The screen flashed green. I navigated to the History tab, and there it was. The digital autopsy of her negligence. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I just stared at the cold, hard data. It wasn't an opinion. It wasn't a he said, she said. It was math. I took a screenshot. The image is burned into my retina. It read, Event ID, hashtag 4092-PWR-INT. Timestamp 16:02:15 to 16:07:55. Duration 340 seconds, 5 minutes, 40 seconds. Status: power disconnected manually. Patient SpO2 alert, critical, less than 75%. 5 minutes and 40 seconds. It was just a second, my dad had said. The cord slipped. Linda had lied. But the machine didn't lie. The machine knew that for 340 seconds, while she was vacuuming a rug, I was slowly suffocating. The machine recorded the exact moment my oxygen levels dropped into the critical zone, the zone where brain damage starts to become a conversation topic. I mean, looking at that graph was like looking at a photo of someone holding a gun to my head. It validated every fear, every instinct I had buried to keep the peace. But it wasn't enough. I knew how Linda worked. She would look at this data and say, "Oh, the machine is glitchy." Or, "I didn't realize it was that long. I lost track of time." She would plead ignorance. She would play the overwhelmed caregiver card. I needed her to admit it. I needed her to confirm that she knew exactly what she was doing. I sat back on the bed, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I could hear the guests starting to arrive, the muffled greetings, the laughter, the clinking of wine glasses. The party was starting. She would be distracted. She would be high on the adrenaline of being the perfect hostess. She would be checking her phone to see if the florist had texted back, or if her friends were posting photos. It was the perfect time to set the trap. I opened my text messages. My thumb hovered over the send button. I had to word this perfectly. I couldn't sound angry. That would put her on the defensive. I had to sound weak. I had to sound like the victim she wanted me to be. I had to give her the opportunity to be cruel because I knew she couldn't resist it. I typed, "Linda, please be careful with the cord tonight. Honestly, when you unplugged me earlier, I passed out. I think it was off for like 5 minutes. I'm scared." I hit send. Then, the waiting game. The 3 little dots appeared and disappeared. She was typing. Then she stopped. Maybe she was greeting a guest. Maybe she was reconsidering. My stomach twisted into a knot. If she ignored it, I had nothing but a graph. If she came into the room to yell at me, I had no recording. I needed her to put it in writing. I watched the phone screen until my eyes burned. The sounds of the party grew louder, a swell of music and chatter that felt miles away, even though it was just through the wall. Buzz. The phone vibrated in my hand so hard I almost dropped it. A single message. I opened it. And honestly, reading it felt like a physical blow. It was so casual, so dismissive, so utterly devoid of humanity that it took my breath away faster than the pneumonia ever did. It read, "It was barely 5 minutes. The rug looked awful. Stop whining or I'm moving you to the basement. Smile when you come out." I read it 3 times. It was barely 5 minutes. Admission of the timeline. The rug looked awful. Admission of the priority. Stop whining or I'm moving you to the basement. The threat. She didn't deny it. She justified it. She confirmed that she knew the duration and that her motive was cosmetic. She confirmed that my safety was conditional on her mood. My hands went cold. Not the shaky cold of fear, but the still, dead cold of a corpse. The ringing in my ears stopped. The anxiety that had been vibrating under my skin for months just vanished. I wasn't Maya, the sick daughter, anymore. I was the person holding the murder weapon. I quietly took a screenshot of the text. Then I backed it up to the cloud. Then I emailed it to a secondary account she didn't know about. I mean, I was locking this evidence down like it was the nuclear launch codes. I looked at the door. I could hear Linda's voice, that high tinkling laugh she used when she was flirting with the HOA president. She sounded so happy. She sounded so secure. She thought she had buried me in this room, silenced by my illness and my father's cowardice. She had no idea that I wasn't just surviving in here, I was reloading. Honestly, the transition from victim to executioner isn't as dramatic as they make it look in the movies. There's no mounting music, no slow-motion walk. It's actually very quiet. It's the silence of a sniper adjusting their scope. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, just breathing. The machine next to me was humming its steady, mechanical rhythm, the rhythm Linda had interrupted for a clean rug. I looked at the text message one last time. "Stop whining or I'm moving you to the basement." That wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. If I didn't act tonight, I knew exactly where I would end up. I'd be in the unfinished basement, breathing mold and dust out of sight, while she hosted her garden parties upstairs. You have to understand, up until this moment, Linda held all the cards. She controlled the house, the money, my father, kin, and quite literally the air I breathed. She was the puppet master, and I was just the marionette with tangled strings. But now I had the scissors. The first step was neutralizing her leverage. Linda's power came from my dependency. She knew I couldn't leave because I couldn't carry the equipment, and I couldn't drive. She knew I was trapped. So before I could burn her world down, I had to build my own life raft. I quietly pulled my duffel bag from under the bed. It was dusty. Another thing Linda would have hated. But I didn't care. I moved with the efficiency of a soldier packing for deployment. I didn't pack clothes. I packed the essentials. My portable oxygen concentrator, the battery-operated one, my medications, my charger, and my hard drive with the backup of her text admission. I zipped it up and hid it behind the curtains. And I wasn't planning on staying to watch the aftermath. When the police took her out the front door, I intended to walk out right behind them. Next came the call. And here's the thing about calling the police on a family member. You can't sound emotional. If you sound hysterical, they treat it like a domestic dispute and send a patrol car to tell everyone to calm down. I didn't want a mediator. I wanted an arrest. I went into the attached bathroom and turned on the shower to mask my voice. The steam filled the room, warm and thick. I dialed the non-emergency line for the local precinct, not 911. Why? Because I wanted to speak to a desk sergeant, not a dispatcher. I wanted to use specific legal terminology. When the officer answered, I didn't say, "My stepmom is mean to me." I kept my voice low, clinical, and terrifyingly calm. I told him I needed to report an active case of medical endangerment and attempted manslaughter. I gave him the address. I told him that a life-sustaining medical device had been intentionally disconnected by a guardian, resulting in a hypoxic event, and that I had digital logs and a written admission of guilt via text message confirming the intent was malicious. I mean, I could hear the officer's tone shift through the phone. He went from bored desk cop to scribbling furiously in about 10 seconds. I emphasized that the perpetrator was currently hosting a party and that I was fearful of retaliation if I tried to leave on my own. I requested a welfare check with an escort. He told me officers would be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That was the window. That was the time I had to survive. Now came the hardest part, the mask. And to make this work, Linda had to believe she had won. If she sensed even a flicker of rebellion, she would be on guard. She would hide the vacuum. She would play the victim before the cops even arrived. I needed her to be at her absolute peak of arrogance. I needed her to be so confident in her control over me that she wouldn't even see the knife coming until it was buried in her reputation. I looked in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes were rimmed with red from the earlier suffocation, and my hair was a mess. Perfect. I looked exactly like the broken, defeated invalid she wanted me to be. I didn't try to fix it. I leaned into it. I let my shoulders slump. I practiced a wobbly, pathetic smile. I walked out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The noise of the party hit me like a physical wave. Laughter, the clink of silverware, to the jazz music playing softly in the background. It smelled of expensive wine and roasted lamb. It smelled of money. I turned the corner into the living room. The scene was almost grotesque in its perfection. About 20 people were mingling, holding crystal flutes of champagne. The lighting was dim and warm. The famous rug, the one that had cost me 5 minutes of oxygen, was pristine, anchoring the room like a beige altar. And there was Linda, holding court in the center of it all. She looked stunning. I'll give her that. She was wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than my first car, holding a glass of white wine, laughing at something the HOA president was saying. Her hand was resting possessively on my father's arm. He looked tired, but he was smiling, playing the part of the happy husband. When Linda saw me, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes. God, her eyes were like shards of ice. She paused her conversation and looked at me with this triumphant, predatory glint. She was waiting for me to make a scene. She was waiting for me to complain so she could roll her eyes and apologize to her guests for her difficult stepdaughter. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I walked over to her, dragging my portable oxygen tank behind me like a penitent carrying a cross. I stopped right in front of her and the HOA president. The conversation in the immediate circle died down. Everyone was looking at the sick girl. I looked Linda dead in the eye, and I lied. I gave the performance of a lifetime. I made my voice shake just enough to sound weak. I apologized. I told her, in front of everyone, that I was so sorry for the misunderstanding earlier with the vacuum. I told her she was right. The rug looked beautiful, and I shouldn't have been so dramatic about the noise. You should have seen her face. For a split second, she looked confused. She was ready for a fight, and I had just handed her a surrender. Then the confusion melted into pure, unadulterated smugness. She practically glowed. She squeezed my arm, hard, her nails digging into my skin just enough to hurt, and gave a little laugh that sounded like wind chimes made of broken glass. She turned to her guests and basically announced that I was having a rough recovery, but that she was doing her best to keep things orderly. She framed my apology as proof of her excellent parenting. She was the saint who had tamed the unruly, sick child. My father looked at me with this pathetic gratitude. He actually squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you, sweetie." He thought I was finally behaving. He thought the peace was kept. He had no idea that I wasn't apologizing, I was stalling. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, playing the prop in her perfect life. I let her parade me around for a few minutes. I let the guests look at me with that mix of pity and discomfort. I let Linda make little passive-aggressive jokes about how much electricity my machine used. Every time she spoke, every time she laughed, I checked the time on my phone. 5 minutes left. I excused myself, claiming I needed to sit down. I retreated to a wingback chair in the corner, near the window that faced the street. From here, I had a clear view of the driveway. I had a clear view of Linda, who was now standing on the very rug she had nearly killed me for, tapping a spoon against her glass to make a toast. The room went quiet. The guests turned to her. She beamed, soaking up the attention like sunlight. She started speaking about gratitude and family and sacrifice. I just sat there, clutching my phone, watching the street. I wasn't listening to her speech. I was listening for the sirens. But then I remembered. I had asked for a silent approach. No sirens. Just the heavy, authoritative crunch of tires on gravel. And then I saw it. Through the sheer curtains, lights cut through the darkness. Not the flashing strobe of a chase, but the steady, silent sweep of headlights turning into the driveway. One squad car, then a second. Then an ambulance. Its lights flashing, but its siren off. Linda was midway through a sentence about how hard she worked to keep this home a sanctuary. She had her back to the window. She didn't see the blue and red lights dancing across the faces of her guests. She didn't notice that the HOA president's smile had faltered, his eyes darting to the window behind her. She was talking about the purity of the home. I looked at my phone. The recording app was running. The evidence was queued. The police were at the door. Honestly, acting nice was harder than the actual planning. But watching her standing there, completely oblivious, raising a glass to her own vanity while the law walked up her driveway steps, that made every second of the suffocation worth it. The moments before a bomb goes off are always quieter than you expect. You imagine chaos, screaming, running, but in reality, there is just this heavy, pressurized silence where the air feels too thick to breathe. I sat in that high-backed velvet chair in the corner, my hands folded in my lap like a dutiful daughter, watching the scene unfold with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat running a maze it doesn't know is rigged. The dining room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of the chandelier. The crystal was sparkling. The silverware was polished to a mirror shine. And through the sheer white curtains behind Linda, the silent, rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights had begun to wash over the room. It was hypnotic. Red, blue, red, blue. Linda, of course, had her back to the window. She was standing at the head of the table, tapping a silver spoon against her champagne flute. Ting, 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 demanding the room's attention. She was so absorbed in her own performance that she didn't notice the way the HOA president's smile faltered. She didn't see the neighbor's wife lower her wine glass, her eyes widening as they darted from Linda's beaming face to the police cruiser parked silently on the front lawn. Honestly, the disconnect was almost art. Here was a woman who had spent her entire life curating the perfect image, completely unaware that the backdrop of her big speech was a felony traffic stop. And the speech? God, the speech. If I hadn't already been numb, her words would have made me scream. She didn't just welcome everyone. She martyred herself. She stood there, wore wrapped in silk that cost more than my monthly medication, and launched into this monologue about the burden of care. She spoke with this soft, trembling voice, telling the room how exhausted she was, how difficult the last few months had been for her. She didn't mention the pneumonia. She didn't mention the nights I spent gasping for air. Instead, she talked about the clutter. She actually made a joke, a light, airy little laugh escaping her lips, about how hard it was to keep a house magazine ready when there were ugly medical machines and rubber tubes, tripping her up at every turn. You have to understand the level of narcissism required to stand in front of 20 people and complain about the aesthetics of your stepdaughter's life support. She looked right at me, offering this pitying, tight-lipped smile, and said that despite the eyesore of the equipment and the sky-high electricity bills from running the oxygen concentrator 24 hours a day, she did it because family is everything. The room went deadly silent. I mean, even her friends, the people who usually ate up her act with a spoon, shifted uncomfortably. I saw my father look down at his shoes, swirling the ice in his scotch, unwilling to meet my gaze. He knew. He knew exactly how much that machine cost to run, and he knew it was a fraction of what Linda spent on her weekly dry cleaning. But he said nothing. He just let her paint me as a financial drain, a burden she was graciously tolerating. But the kicker? The moment that really sealed her fate? She actually had the audacity to bring up the rug. She gestured to the floor, the very spot where I had nearly passed out an hour ago, and told the room a little anecdote about how she had to scramble to get a stain out just before they arrived. She laughed and said something about how she was so committed to perfection that she would move heaven and earth to make sure her home was welcoming. She didn't move heaven and earth. She moved a plug, and she nearly moved me into a morgue. I felt a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile you see on a statue in a graveyard. I looked at the digital clock on the mantelpiece. The police had been in the driveway for exactly 90 seconds. They were assessing the scene. They were probably checking the perimeter. The tension in the room was physical. The guests were starting to whisper. A few of them had turned fully toward the window, watching the shadows of uniformed officers walking up the long paved path. The blue light swept across the dinner table, turning the roasted lamb a sickly purple, then back to gold, then purple again. Linda finally noticed the distraction. She stopped mid-sentence, her brow furrowing. She looked annoyed that her audience was looking past her, not at her. She actually tapped the glass again, harder this time, a sharp clink that sounded like a warning shot. She asked, with this confused, irritated little laugh, what everyone was staring at. She jokingly asked if the caterers had arrived with the dessert early. And then, the sound cut through the room like a knife. Dong, dong. The heavy brass door knocker echoed through the house. It wasn't the polite ring of a guest. It was the authoritative, heavy-handed knock of someone who isn't asking for permission to enter. Linda froze. Her smile stayed plastered on her face, but her eyes darted to my father. She looked confused, then annoyed. She clearly thought it was a delivery driver ruining her toast. She huffed, a sharp exhale of frustration, and smoothed down her dress. She apologized to the guests for the interruption, her voice dripping with that fake hostess warmth, and marched toward the hallway. Probably just the florist with the wrong address. She muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. You can't get good help these days. I watched her walk away. I watched the way her heels clicked on the floor. I watched the way she held her head high, so sure of her authority, so sure that whatever was on the other side of that door was something she could dismiss, pay off, or yell at. She had no idea that the help on her porch was carrying a warrant. I didn't move. I didn't look at my dad. I just kept my eyes on the empty archway where she had disappeared, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. I heard the heavy oak door creak open. I heard Linda's voice, sharp and commanding. Can I help you? We are in the middle of a... And then, I heard the voice that changed the temperature of the entire house. It was a deep, flat baritone. Mrs. Linda Vance? I'm Sergeant Miller with the Metro Police. We have received a report of a domestic disturbance involving a medical emergency. I need you to step aside. The silence in the dining room shattered. The guests gasped. My father dropped his glass. It hit the floor and didn't break, just bounced with a dull thud, spilling amber liquid across the pristine carpet. But I didn't look at the stain. I looked at the hallway. Because the show wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sound of heavy, police-issue boots hitting hardwood floors is distinct. It doesn't sound like a guest arriving. It sounds like an invasion. And that is exactly what happened. Two uniformed officers and a sergeant walked right past Linda, ignoring her outstretched hand, and stepped directly onto the beige Persian rug she had spent the entire afternoon protecting. I mean, the visual was striking. You had the soft, ambient lighting of a high society dinner party, the smell of roasted lamb and expensive perfume, and then suddenly, the sharp, discordant reality of law enforcement standing in the center of the room. The sergeant didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at the crystal chandelier. He looked straight at me, sitting in the corner with my oxygen tank, and gave a sharp, imperceptible nod. Linda, of course, tried to regain control immediately. She let out this breathless, incredulous laugh, the kind she used when a waiter brought the wrong wine, and tried to shepherd them back toward the foyer. She actually put a hand on the sergeant's arm, flashing that practiced, dazzling smile, and told him there must be a misunderstanding. She said something about a prank call and looked pointedly at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. She was already spinning the narrative, ready to tell the officers that her stepdaughter was unstable and acting out. But the sergeant didn't smile back. He didn't move toward the door. He gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm, and the way he did it, slowly, deliberately, made the entire room go dead silent. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest. It wasn't a warrant yet, but it was the printout of the text message I had emailed to the precinct. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the room without him even raising it. "We aren't here for a noise complaint. We are here to investigate a report of felony reckless endangerment involving a dependent adult." You could hear a pin drop. The HOA president, who was mid-sip of his Pinot Noir, froze with the glass halfway to his mouth. My father, who had been trying to shrink into the drapes, suddenly stepped forward, his face pale. He tried to speak, tried to say it was just a family matter, but the officer held up a hand and silenced him. Then, the sergeant did something beautiful. He didn't summarize the evidence, he read it. He looked at Linda, then at the guests, and read the text message out loud, verbatim. It was barely 5 minutes. The rug looked awful. "Stop whining or I'm moving you to the basement." I watched the room. It was like watching a dam break. At first, there was confusion. Then, as the words sank in, "Stop whining." The rug looked awful. The confusion turned into horror. These were people who had children. These were people who prided themselves on being good neighbors. And they had just heard their hostess admit, in writing, that she had risked a human life for a clean floor. The public saint mask didn't just crack, it shattered. I saw the neighbor's wife cover her mouth, her eyes wide, looking from Linda to me. I saw the look of absolute disgust on the face of the man Linda had been flirting with all night. The air in the room shifted from admiration to revulsion in the span of 3 seconds. Linda's reaction was the most telling. She didn't cry. She didn't look remorseful. She got angry. Her face turned a blotchy, ugly red, and she started sputtering. She didn't deny sending the text. She denied the implication. She started yelling that it was taken out of context, that I was manipulative, that I had provoked her by being messy. She was digging her own grave with every word. She turned to my father, demanding he fix this, demanding he tell them what a burden I was. But my father, for the first time in his life, he didn't move. He looked at the officers, then he looked at me, pale, hooked up to a machine, clutching my phone. And then he looked at his wife. He saw the monster. He saw the woman who had valued a rug over his daughter's life, and he stepped back. He actually took a physical step away from her, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room. That was the breaking point. Linda realized she was losing the audience. The narcissist in her couldn't handle the rejection. She started screaming. She lost all composure. She shrieked that the officers were ruining her party, that they were muddying her floors, that they had no right to be there. The sergeant decided he had heard enough. He signaled his partner. "Linda Vance, you are under arrest for attempted manslaughter and domestic abuse of a dependent." The words hung in the air like smoke, and then came the physical reality. The officer reached for her wrist. Linda recoiled like a snake, slapping his hand away. "Don't you touch me," she screamed. "Do you know who I am?" Bad move. The officers didn't hesitate. They spun her around. The sound of the struggle, the scuffle of boots on the precious rug, the rustle of silk, the sharp intake of breath from the guests, was chaotic and ugly. Linda was thrashing, kicking out, knocking over a chair. Click, click. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut is loud. It's a mechanical, final sound that cuts through everything. Linda gasped. She was bent over the dining table, her cheek pressed against the wood, her arms wrenched behind her back. The officer pulled her up, not gently. Her hair was in her face. Her dress was twisted. She looked wild, feral, and completely unhinged. The officers began to walk her toward the door. They had to march her right past the dinner table. She was hyperventilating, sobbing now. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of rage. She was cursing at the guests for not helping her. She was cursing at my father for being weak. As they dragged her past my chair, she stopped struggling for a second. She locked eyes with me. Her mascara was running. Her face was twisted in hate. She looked like a demon finally exposed to the light. She hissed at me. "I gave you a home. I cleaned up your filth. You ungrateful little—" The officer jerked her forward, cutting her off. "Keep moving, ma'am." But I didn't let her leave without a goodbye. I stood up. I took a slow, deep breath of the oxygen she had tried to steal from me. I looked her dead in the eye, right in front of the silent, horrified crowd of her former admirers. I said, "You missed a spot." I pointed to the floor where the officer's boots had left a streak of mud on the beige wool. The color drained from her face. She tried to lunge at me, but the officers tightened their grip and hauled her out the front door. And the last thing I heard was her screaming about the rug as they shoved her into the back of the squad car. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was the silence of a vacuum. Not the machine, but the void left when a storm finally passes. The guests didn't know what to do. Some were already grabbing their coats, muttering apologies to no one in particular, desperate to escape the scene of the crime. My father was sitting in a chair, head in his hands, looking like a man who had just woken up from a 10-year coma. I sat back down. I checked my oxygen levels. 98%. I took a sip of water. It tasted like victory. The party didn't end. It evaporated. You've never seen a room clear out faster than a high society dinner party that has just become an active crime scene. The guests didn't say goodbye. They didn't thank the host. They just grabbed their coats and fled, heads down, eyes averted, like they were escaping a burning building. They left their half-eaten lamb on the plates and their wine in the glasses, creating this eerie, abandoned tableau of luxury interrupted by reality. My father sat at the head of the table for a long time, staring at the empty chair where his wife had been sitting just minutes before. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The silence in the house was absolute. No humming vacuum, no clinking silverware, no sharp critical voice telling me to sit up straight. Just the heavy, suffocating weight of consequences finally arriving. The legal fallout was, in a word, catastrophic. Linda's defense strategy crumbled before it even began. Her lawyer, a slick, expensive man she insisted on hiring despite the cost, tried to argue that it was an accidental disconnect and that I was exaggerating the medical impact. But he hadn't seen the data logs, and he certainly hadn't seen the text message. When the prosecutor presented that screenshot, "Stop whining or I'm moving you to the basement," the plea deal vanished. You can't argue accident when you've admitted to punishment in writing. She was charged with reckless endangerment, attempted manslaughter, and abuse of a dependent adult. That last charge? That's the one that sticks. That's the one that makes you a pariah even in prison. I didn't go to the trial. No, I didn't need to. My deposition was enough, and the machine's hard drive told the rest of the story. But I did see the photos in the paper. Linda, stripped of her designer silk and her highlights, wearing a baggy gray county jumpsuit that washed out her complexion. She looked old. She looked angry. She looked like exactly what she was, a bully who had finally picked a fight she couldn't win. The financial ruin was slower, more painful, and honestly, more satisfying to watch. Linda's bail was set astronomically high because of the flight risk associated with her husband's assets. To pay for it, and to pay for the mounting legal fees, my father had to start liquidating the museum. I remember the day the estate sale happened. I drove by, just to see it. Strangers were walking across her precious lawn. People were rifling through her antique furniture, touching her curtains with greasy hands, haggling over the price of the crystal vases she used to scream at me for looking at. The very objects she had valued over my life were being sold for pennies on the dollar to pay for her defense against trying to kill me. The house, her sanctuary, her temple of cleanliness, went on the market 3 months later. It didn't sell quickly. It had the stink of scandal on it. The for sale sign sat on the lawn for months, slowly tilting to the side, the grass growing long and unruly around it because there was no one left to scream at the gardeners. As for the social fallout, it was total. The HOA board didn't just remove her, they erased her. The neighbors who used to vie for invites to her parties now crossed the street to avoid walking past her driveway. The public saint mask had been ripped off, and underneath, everyone saw the rot. She wasn't the martyr caring for a sick child. She was the monster who unplugged a lung to plug in a vacuum. My father tried to call me a few times. He left voicemails sounding weepier and more pathetic with each attempt. He talked about healing and moving forward. He wanted to be a family again. But you have to understand, he wasn't a victim. He was the accomplice who held the flashlight while she dug the grave. I blocked his number. I didn't want his apology. I wanted his absence. And so, I moved. I found a small apartment on the other side of town. It's not a mansion. The floors are cheap laminate, not hardwood. And the windows stick when you try to open them. There is dust on the bookshelves because I'm not strong enough to clean every day. And honestly, I don't care. I'm sitting on my balcony right now. The sun is setting, casting this long golden light over the city. My oxygen concentrator is humming quietly inside, a steady, rhythmic whoosh that doesn't sound like a burden anymore. It sounds like a heartbeat. I'm holding a glass of cheap wine. It tastes a little like vinegar, but to me, it's the sweetest thing I've ever drank. The air out here is different. It doesn't smell like bleach. It doesn't smell like aggressive lavender aerosol. It smells like exhaust fumes and rain and takeout food from the place downstairs. It smells messy. It smells imperfect. It smells like I'm alive. I take a deep breath, a real, deep breath that fills my lungs all the way to the bottom, and I let it out slowly. There is no vacuum running in the background. There is no one watching me to see if I scuff the floor. She wanted a clean house. She got it. Her cell is perfectly sterile. And my lungs? They're finally clear.